hoping somebody would ask me to speak again. So the phone rings. Have I got a story for you, she says, but you've got to keep my name out of it. Or you hand a coffee to a rumpled fellow with a bag stuffed full of documents. This is pretty big, he says, his voice shaking, but you can never tell who gave you this. Or in the research of a story, you find someone who can corroborate as a second source the information somebody else has already provided, but only if you keep that person's identity secret. How about this one? More and more we see emails arriving. An email arrives from what is obviously a concocted address. Joe's source says he has the goods on a political leader. But before a meeting, you must agree to one thing: confidentiality. Before the public, before a court. Buddy, he says, you got to take this one to the grave. Is this fiction or fantasy? All four of these things have happened to me this month. So what's a poor journalist to do faced with all this stuff and a desire to get stories? Do you remember the old expression, don't buy a pig in a poke? In medieval times, a poke was a satchel or a bag, and people would go around, believe it or not, trying to sell a cat. Lots of cats were available, pigs were not. It was a cat, but they were trying to sell it as a pig. Don't buy a pig in a poke. Don't agree to confidentiality with the source unless you know what the source is offering and who the source is. When I get calls like the ones I described, as many journalists do, I start asking questions. If the person is legitimate and has real information that will expose something in the public interest, they will understand that you cannot just quickly agree to confidentiality. If they resist getting into the details and threaten to, in our case, usually go to the Globe or CBC, well, I say go to the Globe or CBC, because it means you're not legitimate if you're not willing to tell me who you are and where you got the information. The ability to provide a confidentiality promise to a source is very important to our jobs. Where it gets sticky is the reason for confidentiality. Is it because perhaps the source has a fear of physical retaliation or death? Does the source fear losing his job? Is the source embarrassed about something? Was the source part of a criminal act and wants to rat out the ringleaders? These are the type of questions you have to get answered. All are valuable reasons in the source's eye, but a court will not look favorably on a reporter who shields a source simply because he or she is embarrassed. I try hard to use only sources to get me information. This is the best use of the confidentiality agreement, because if it works, then that's the end of it. I try not to have stories that say sources say. I can give you two quick examples where I used a source, and in one case a criminal court asked me to reveal the source. In the other case, the institution outed the source, but I never did. Some years ago, I was approached by an Iranian gentleman who owned a bar in Toronto. He told me that the provincial liquor inspectors were shaking down new Canadians for bribes in return for liquor licenses. We tried to investigate this in the usual fashion, but ended up setting up a fake bar application, a fake bar, and eventually made a $500 cash payment to the inspector. The story, as Bert knows too well, is actually a lot longer. But when all the dust, it involved me getting arrested myself, but when all the dust settled and the police arrested the inspector and charged him with corruption, I was summoned to testify at the criminal court. The defense lawyer for this inspector wanted to know how we got onto the story. I refused to answer the question, and arguments were made by the Star's lawyers that I had the right to confidentiality for my source. The judge on the case ruled that the identity of the source was not germane to the case. And there I lost my big chance to go to jail and be famous. The other case is much more recent and much more upsetting to me. And it shows you the lengths that an institution will go to out a source. I can't tell you too much about this because I still must keep my promise to the source. But it involves a matter of public safety in the city of Toronto. A member of one of our emergency services department told me of a serious problem that threatened lives in the city. The only way to get the information was for the person to obtain the data I needed from City of Toronto-owned computers. The person did this on my behalf. The stories caused quite a stir. After they were published, the city agency went on a witch hunt. They asked me who my source was, and I told them to stuff it. Using what I think is probably an illegal search, they obtained information from the city computers that proved in their eyes they had the name of the source. As punishment, the source was docked 1/4 of his pay for 2 years. In the eyes of the city bosses, it was more important to protect their secrecy than to celebrate a whistleblower or to fix a problem. It's awful that that happened, and because I've not been released from my promise, I cannot really tell the story properly, and I cannot publish it. But in that case, the source did the right thing. If a court had asked me to reveal the person's identity, I would have gone to jail instead of talking. A shield law in this country would be nice to have, but in its absence, journalists have to do their due diligence before giving a promise, and once the promise is given, they must stand by it. And that's it.